North Africa, May 1943. The war ended for them in the desert dust. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered after the fall of the Afrika Korps, their boots worn through, their canteens empty. They expected cruelty from American captors. They had been told stories propaganda leaflets showed Allied soldiers as savages who tortured prisoners, denied them food, left them to rot in cages under merciless sun. Yet 3 months later, aboard a Liberty ship crossing the Atlantic, Corporal Franz Richter would smell something that would shatter everything he'd been taught to believe. Bacon sizzling in an American mess hall. Real meat. The scent would break him in ways combat never could. The propaganda had prepared them for suffering. Leaflets distributed throughout the Afrika Korps showed drawings of starving men in wire cages, skeletal hands reaching through barbed fences. American cruelty was a certainty, they were told. The enemy did not honor the rules of war. Surrender meant death by inches, starvation, exposure, disease in filthy camps where prisoners slept in mud and ate scraps thrown to them like dogs. Franz Richter, 22 years old, from a small village outside Mannheim, had believed it all. He came from a family that survived on black bread and potatoes during the lean years after the First World War. His father spoke of hunger with the reverence some men reserved for God. Food was sacred, scarce, something you fought to protect. In the Afrika Korps, rations dwindled to hardtack biscuits and watery soup. Meat became a memory. Real coffee vanished, replaced by bitter ersatz brewed from acorns. By April 1943, soldiers scavenged cactus fruit and hunted rats near their positions. When Rommel's forces collapsed in Tunisia, Franz stood with empty pockets and an empty belly. Around him, men dropped their rifles without protest. The fight had left them before the ammunition did. American and British forces swept through their positions like a tide. Franz raised his hands and felt nothing, not fear, not relief, only exhaustion and a grinding animal hunger that made his vision blur. The holding camps in North Africa were vast wire enclosures in the desert. Thousands of men sat in the sun with no shelter, waiting for transport. The ground baked hard as iron. Dust clung to everything: uniforms, skin, the inside of throats. Franz expected the worst. He remembered the propaganda, the drawings of skeletal prisoners. He waited for the beatings, the starvation rations, the casual violence. Instead, American soldiers distributed water canisters. They set up field kitchens and cooked stew in enormous pots. The food was basic beans, bread, canned meat, but it was food, real portions. Franz ate slowly, afraid his shrunken stomach would reject it. Around him, men wept as they chewed, not from joy, but from confusion. They had been lied to, and the realization settled heavy as stones. 2 weeks later, trucks carried them to the port of Oran on the Algerian coast. Franz had never seen the Mediterranean. Under different circumstances, he might have found it beautiful, the blue water stretching to the horizon, white buildings glowing in afternoon light. Instead, he saw only the ships waiting at anchor. Liberty ships, American cargo vessels repurposed to carry human freight. He and 400 other prisoners were herded into the hold, a cavernous space that smelled of engine oil and rust. The crossing took 2 weeks. The ship rolled through heavy Atlantic swells. Men vomited into buckets. The air below deck grew thick and stale. Franz lay on a narrow bunk and stared at the steel ceiling inches from his face. He thought about his mother's kitchen in Mannheim, the smell of bread baking, the way sunlight slanted through the window on Sunday mornings. He wondered if he would ever see it again. Twice daily, American sailors brought food down the ladder: stew, bread, coffee. Real coffee this time, not the burnt acorn substitute they'd endured in North Africa. The coffee was weak and bitter, but it was genuine. Franz cradled the tin cup in both hands and inhaled the steam. The small luxury felt obscene. He was a prisoner an enemy, yet they fed him better than his own army had in the final months of the campaign. On the 12th day at sea, Franz woke to the sounds of men shouting above deck. The engines had changed pitch. Land, someone whispered. America. The word rippled through the hold like electricity. Men climbed from bunks and pressed toward the ladder, desperate for a glimpse. When Franz finally reached the deck, he saw the coast of Virginia emerging from morning haze-green hills, wooden docks, warehouses painted white. It looked nothing like the bombed cities he expected. It looked untouched by war. They disembarked at Norfolk on August 4th, 1943. The heat hit Franz like a fist. Virginia's summer heat, humid and thick, worse than the desert. Guards lined them up on the dock and counted them like cattle. American soldiers in clean uniforms watched with expressions. Franz couldn't read not hatred, not pity, just bored efficiency. They were processed through a receiving station, photographed, fingerprinted, issued new clothing. The uniforms were surplus American fatigues with PW painted in white letters on the back. Then came the trains. Franz had expected freight cars, boxcars with straw on the floor. Instead, he climbed aboard a passenger coach with upholstered seats and windows that opened. The guards took positions at either end of the car, but made no move to restrain the prisoners. They simply sat and watched as the train pulled away from the coast and rolled west through the green Virginia countryside. Franz pressed his face to the window. Farmhouses dotted the landscape, barns painted red, fields of corn stretching to tree lines. Children played in yards. Women hung laundry on clotheslines. Everything looked prosperous, untouched, impossibly normal. There were no bomb craters, no burned villages, no columns of refugees clogging the roads. The war existed somewhere else, in newspapers and radio broadcasts, but not here. Not in this quiet, abundant country that seemed to sleep under endless sun. That night, as the train crossed into North Carolina, Franz smelled it for the first time. The scent drifted from the forward car, where American soldiers ate their evening meal. At first, he couldn't identify it something savory and rich, a smell he hadn't encountered in months, maybe years. Then recognition hit him like a blow. Bacon, strips of pork belly, fried crisp and fatty. The aroma filled the passenger car, and around Franz, men fell silent. No one spoke. They simply sat and breathed in the smell, their faces slack with longing. Franz felt tears burn his eyes. He had not cried when captured, had not cried crossing the Atlantic in the ship's dark hold. But this simple smell of meat cooking undid him completely. It was the smell of abundance, of a world that had not been picked clean by hunger. It was proof that America had not suffered, that its people ate well while Europe starved. The contrast was devastating. The train carried them south through the Carolinas and into Texas. 2 days of watching prosperous farmland scrolled past the windows. Franz saw cattle grazing in pastures, chickens scratching in yards, trucks loaded with produce heading to market. Everywhere food. The propaganda had shown America on the brink of collapse, its industries crippled, its people starving under the weight of war. But the evidence of Franz's own eyes told a different story. This was a country drowning in plenty. They arrived at Camp Huntsville in East Texas on a morning in mid-August. The camp sprawled across hundreds of acres of pine forest and red clay. Neat rows of wooden barracks stretched in geometric precision. Guard towers rose at intervals along double fences topped with barbed wire. Floodlights hung on poles, ready to turn night into day. But the barracks looked solid, new-built, with real roofs and screened windows, not tents. Not wire cages in open desert. Actual buildings. Guards marched them through the gate and divided them into groups. Franz's unit was assigned to Compound 3. They filed into a barracks that smelled of fresh lumber and pine sap. Inside, rows of metal cots stood lined up with military precision. Each bed had a mattress, a pillow, 2 blankets folded square. Footlockers sat at the end of each cot. The floor was swept clean. A pot-bellied stove occupied the center of the room, cold now in August heat, but ready for winter. Franz sat on his assigned cot and felt the mattress compress under his weight. He ran his hand over the ticking. It was thin, standard army issue, but it was a mattress. He had slept on sand in North Africa, on bare steel in the ship's hold. This felt like luxury. Around him, men tested their beds, opened footlockers, explored the space with tentative wonder. No one had beaten them. No one had shouted or threatened. The guards simply pointed to the barracks and walked away. At evening, they were marched to the mess hall for their first meal in camp. Franz entered a long wooden building filled with tables and benches. The air inside was thick with heat and the smell of cooking. At the far end, American soldiers in kitchen whites worked behind steam tables, ladling food onto metal trays. The prisoners formed a line and shuffled forward. Franz took a tray and held it out. A cook filled it without looking at him, a mound of potatoes, green beans, and a thick slice of meat. Real meat, dark and glistening with gravy. Franz stared at the tray. He had not seen a portion this size since before the war. He carried it to a table and sat, and for a long moment he couldn't bring himself to eat. He just looked at the food, disbelieving. Around him, men ate in silence. Some wept openly. Others simply stared at their plates, forks trembling in their hands. The meat was pork roast, tender and fatty. The potatoes were real, not the dehydrated flakes they'd endured in the desert. The beans were fresh. There was bread, too white American bread, that some of the men found too soft and bland, but Franz ate it anyway. He ate everything slowly, methodically, until his stomach ached with fullness. Later, back in the barracks, Franz lay on his cot and tried to process what he'd experienced. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. He was a prisoner of war, an enemy combatant, yet he'd been fed better than he'd eaten in his own army. The propaganda had been a lie. The Americans were not savages. They were following the Geneva Conventions, treating prisoners according to international law, feeding them the same rations provided to their own soldiers. But understanding this intellectually did not ease the confusion. Franz had grown up in a Germany that glorified sacrifice, that praised suffering as noble. Food rationing at home had been portrayed as patriotic duty. The regime's propaganda had insisted that Germans were strong, disciplined, capable of enduring hardship, while their enemies grew weak and soft. Yet here in this Texas camp, the evidence contradicted everything. The Americans had food to spare. They fed their enemies without resentment or cruelty. The abundance felt like an indictment. Days turned to weeks. The routine of camp life established itself. Wake at 6 to the sound of whistles. German officers enforced discipline among their own men. The Americans delegated authority to ranking prisoners, who maintained military order within the compounds. Morning roll call. Breakfast in the mess hall. Work assignments for those who volunteered. Lunch. Recreation time. Dinner. Evening roll call. Lights out at 10. Franz volunteered for farm labor. The camp provided workers to local farms desperate for help. Most young American men were overseas, and the harvest couldn't wait. Each morning, trucks collected volunteers and drove them to cotton fields, vegetable farms, timber operations. The work was hard, hot, monotonous, but it broke the tedium of camp life. And the prisoners were paid 80 cents per day in canteen coupons. The money could buy cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing paper. The farmers fed them lunch in the fields. Franz would never forget his first day picking cotton, when the farmer's wife brought out sandwiches at noon, thick slices of ham between fresh bread with mustard and pickles. She poured iced tea from a glass pitcher, real sugar stirred in until it dissolved. The liquid was cold, impossibly cold in the 100-degree heat. Franz drank and felt the sweetness hit his system like electricity. The farmer and his wife watched the prisoners eat. They said nothing, made no conversation. But they didn't look at the Germans with hatred, just wariness, maybe curiosity. They were farmers, practical people who needed help bringing in crops. The fact that the help came from enemy soldiers was simply another strange circumstance in a strange time. It was October when Franz first tasted bacon at the camp. By then, autumn had cooled the Texas heat to something tolerable. The camp kitchen served breakfast early, before dawn, for prisoners assigned to work details. Franz woke in darkness and dressed in the chill. Compound 3 filed to the mess hall through pre-dawn fog that clung to the ground like smoke. The smell hit him as he approached the building. Bacon frying. The scent carried on the morning, air-rich, fatty, impossibly delicious. Franz's stomach clenched. He hadn't eaten bacon in years. Before the war, his family could afford meat, maybe once a week, and even then it was usually sausage or cheap cuts of pork stewed until tender. Bacon was a luxury, something reserved for holidays or special occasions. Inside the mess hall, the kitchen crew was cooking breakfast in enormous quantities. Strips of bacon sizzled on griddles, curling at the edges as fat rendered and dripped. Franz took his tray and watched the cook pile scrambled eggs onto the metal surface, then add 3 strips of bacon. 3 strips. He carried the tray to a table as though it contained something sacred. The bacon was crisp, the edges almost burned, the way Americans preferred it. Franz bit into a strip and closed his eyes. The salt and fat and smoke exploded across his tongue. It tasted of abundance, of a world that had never known true hunger. Around him, men ate with the same reverent silence. Some saved their bacon for last, rationing pleasure. Others devoured it immediately, afraid it might vanish if they waited. For Franz, that breakfast marked the turning point. The bacon was proof undeniable, irrefutable, that the war was lost. Not militarily, though that seemed increasingly certain, but ideologically. The regime at home had promised strength through sacrifice, had insisted that deprivation made the German people superior. Yet here in a Texas prison camp, the enemy fed its captives better than the German army fed its own soldiers. The contrast was damning. That night, Franz wrote a letter home to his mother. The censors would read it before it shipped, so he chose his words carefully. But he told her he was well, that he was eating regular meals, that the Americans treated prisoners fairly. He did not tell her about the bacon. He could not find words to explain what it meant, the way a simple breakfast had shattered his understanding of the world. As autumn deepened, the camp settled into routine. The guards were relaxed, almost bored. Most were older men, or those deemed unfit for combat men, with bad eyes or flat feet or psychological problems that kept them stateside. They supervised the prisoners without enthusiasm, spending most of their time smoking cigarettes and playing cards in the guard towers. The real discipline came from within the compounds, where German officers maintained military order among their men. There were tensions. A handful of hardcore believers men, who still worshipped the regime and dreamed of German victory, tried to enforce loyalty among the other prisoners. They held secret meetings, sang forbidden songs, intimidated anyone who spoke positively about American treatment. In November, these tensions exploded into violence at Camp Huntsville. A prisoner named Hugo Kraus, who had been friendly with guards and volunteered information about contraband radios, was beaten nearly to death with lead pipes. The incident sparked national news coverage and led to reforms, separating pro-regime prisoners from those who wanted nothing more than to survive and go home. Franz kept his head down. He worked his farm assignments, ate his meals, wrote letters home. He attended English classes taught by other prisoners who had been teachers before the war. He read books from the camp library, American novels, technical manuals, newspapers. He tried to understand this strange country that had imprisoned him so gently. Christmas 1943 arrived. The camp administration authorized special holiday meals. Franz sat in the mess hall on Christmas Eve and ate roasted turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, and pie. Real pie made with apples and cinnamon. The meal was better than any Christmas dinner he'd known in Germany, even before the war. Men ate until they couldn't move, and afterward, some vomited from overeating. Their bodies couldn't process such richness after years of scarcity. That night, prisoners gathered in the barracks and sang carols. German songs learned in childhood, songs about silent nights and candlelight and hope. The guards didn't stop them. They simply stood outside and listened, young American men far from their own homes, hearing enemy soldiers sing in a language they couldn't understand. For a few hours, the war receded. There was only music and the shared human need for comfort in darkness. Winter passed. Spring arrived with wildflowers and heat that built slowly toward summer. Franz had been a prisoner for nearly a year. News from Europe grew grimmer. The Allies had landed in Normandy. German cities were burning under Allied bombing. The war was ending. Everyone could see it, but the end came slowly, grinding forward through months of blood and rubble. In the camp, life continued its strange routine. More prisoners arrived as Allied forces swept through France and Belgium. The compounds filled with men who looked worse than the Afrika Korps veterans, thin, haunted, sometimes wounded. These new arrivals spoke of retreat, of soldiers fighting without supplies, of officers issuing orders to defend positions that couldn't be defended. They came to Texas and wept when they saw the food. Franz volunteered to help orient new prisoners. He showed them the barracks, explained the rules, tried to ease their transition. Many didn't believe him when he described the camp routine. They expected beatings, starvation, cruelty. When they sat down to their first meal, pork chops, rice, vegetables, milk some refused to eat, certain it was a trick. Franz had to coax them, had to show them it was real. One evening in April 1945, Franz was walking back from the mess hall when he heard shouting from the administrative building. Guards were running, radios crackled with urgent voices. The camp commander emerged and gathered the staff. Then word spread through the compounds. President Roosevelt was dead. Franz felt nothing. The American president had been an enemy, an obstacle to German victory. But that victory had been a fantasy for so long that his death meant nothing. The war would go on, grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. 3 weeks later, on a morning in early May, the camp woke to news that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Franz sat on his cot and tried to process it. Relief, maybe, but also a strange emptiness. He'd been a soldier, a prisoner, an enemy, and now he was simply a man waiting to go home. The problem was, he had no idea what home would look like. The letters from his mother had stopped months ago. He didn't know if Mannheim still stood, if his family had survived the bombing, if there was anything left to return to. The camp administration began showing newsreels in the recreation hall. Documentary footage of camps discovered by Allied forces Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Franz sat in the darkened hall and watched images that seemed impossible. Mountains of skeletal bodies. Living skeletons staring at cameras with empty eyes. Ovens. Ash. The scope of it was incomprehensible. Many prisoners insisted the footage was propaganda, that Americans had staged it to justify the war. But Franz couldn't make himself believe that. The evidence was too overwhelming, too specific. He thought about the food he'd eaten in Camp Huntsville, the abundance that had shocked him. He thought about the bacon at breakfast, the Christmas turkey, the regular meals that arrived 3 times daily without fail. The Americans knew how to feed people. They had the resources, the infrastructure, the will, which meant the opposite was also true. Starvation was a choice. Those camps in Germany, the images on the screen, were deliberate. The realization left Franz hollow. He'd grown up believing in something, even if that belief had been shaken by months in American captivity. Now there was nothing. Just shame and a bone-deep exhaustion that made it hard to imagine going on. The repatriation process began in late 1945. Prisoners were processed for return to Europe in waves, based on rank and origin. But Europe was a disaster zone. Cities lay in ruins. Food was scarce. The occupation zones had barely established themselves. Many prisoners delayed their return, volunteering for work details, trying to avoid the chaos at home. Franz was among the last groups to ship out, leaving Texas in January 1946. He rode a train east to the coast, then boarded a ship for the Atlantic crossing. This time, the hold wasn't crowded with sick, frightened men, just tired ones, going home to uncertainty. When he arrived in Germany, Franz discovered his mother was alive, but his father had died in an air raid. Mannheim was rubble. Entire neighborhoods had been erased, replaced by fields of broken brick and twisted metal. People lived in cellars and scavenged for food. The ration system was chaos, a few hundred calories a day, mostly bread and watery soup. Franz thought about the bacon. It haunted him, that simple breakfast in a Texas prison camp. The memory felt like betrayal, like he'd lived in luxury while his own people starved. But it also gave him a strange kind of knowledge. He'd seen what prosperity looked like, what a country could be when it wasn't consumed by war and ideology. The Americans weren't supermen. They were just people who'd made different choices, who'd built systems that worked. In the years after, Franz worked to rebuild. Germany rose from the ashes slowly, painfully, but it rose. The Marshall Plan brought aid and investment. Democracy took root, fragile at first, but growing stronger. Franz married, raised children, built a life in a country that bore little resemblance to the one he'd left in 1943. He never talked much about his time as a prisoner. When his children asked about the war, he gave simple answers and changed the subject. But sometimes, on Sunday mornings, he would cook breakfast. Nothing elaborate, just eggs and bacon, prepared the American way, crisp and salty. He would stand at the stove and breathe in the smell, and for a moment, he was 22 again, standing in a Texas mess hall, holding a tray filled with food he'd never expected to receive. The bacon had been a gift, though he couldn't have known it at the time. Not a gift of food, though that mattered. A gift of perspective. It showed him that the propaganda was lies, that the enemy was just people, that abundance existed in the world if you built systems to create it. It was a small thing, 3 strips of fried pork on a metal tray. But small things can shatter worlds, can rebuild them, can change the course of a single human life in ways that echo across decades. The story of German prisoners of war in American camps remains a forgotten chapter of World War II. More than 425,000 German soldiers were held in camps across the United States, most in the South and Southwest. They lived behind barbed wire, but were treated according to the Geneva Conventions, fed American military rations, paid for their labor, and provided with educational and recreational opportunities. The contrast with conditions in Europe was stark. While Allied prisoners in German camps faced hunger and hardship, particularly toward the end of the war when German supplies collapsed, German prisoners in America often gained weight. Many wrote letters home, telling their families to stop sending food packages. They ate better in captivity than they had in their own army. This treatment was not mercy. It was policy driven by practical considerations. America wanted Germany to treat captured Americans well, so it followed international law strictly. The camps were also a propaganda tool, demonstrating American prosperity and fairness. But for individual prisoners, the motivation mattered less than the reality. They were enemies, yet they were fed. That simple fact, bacon at breakfast, turkey at Christmas. Regular meals that arrived without fail communicated more than any amount of propaganda could have. The legacy of these camps is complicated. Some former prisoners returned to Germany, committed to democracy, having seen a different way of organizing society. Others simply went home grateful to have survived. A few stayed in America, marrying American women they met during their captivity, building new lives in the country that had imprisoned them. Franz Richter is a composite, drawn from dozens of real accounts, memoirs, letters, interviews conducted decades after the war. But the details are real. The bacon is real. The confusion, the shame, the gradual realization that the propaganda had been lies, all of it happened, over and over, in camps from Texas to California to Nebraska. Food was power during the Second World War. It determined who lived and who died, who won and who lost. The regimes that chose starvation as policy created mountains of corpses. The nations that chose abundance, that built systems to feed armies and prisoners and civilians, survived and rebuilt. This is the lesson written in every breakfast served in every prison camp on American soil. Power comes not from hoarding, but from creating. Victory comes not from cruelty, but from the capacity to treat enemies as human beings worthy of food and dignity. The smell of bacon in a Texas morning, drifting across a prison compound, was the smell of defeat. Not military defeat, though that came soon enough. Ideological defeat. The death of a worldview built on hierarchy and cruelty and the glorification of suffering. That smell said, "We have enough. We can feed our enemies. We do not fear you, and we do not need to starve you to prove our strength." For Franz Richter and thousands like him, that was the moment the war truly ended. Not when Germany surrendered, but when they smelled bacon frying and realized the propaganda had been lies. When they bit into crisp, fatty meat and tasted abundance they'd been told didn't exist. When they understood, finally, that the enemy was not savages but simply people who built a different kind of society, one that created rather than destroyed, fed rather than starved, treated prisoners according to law rather than vengeance. That breakfast changed them, not all at once, not completely. But it planted seeds doubt in old certainties, hope for different futures, the knowledge that the world didn't have to be organized around scarcity and suffering. When they went home to the ruins of Germany, some carried those seeds with them. Some planted them in soil still smoking from bombs. And slowly, painfully, over decades, something new grew from the wreckage. All because of bacon. 3 strips of fried pork on a metal tray. A small thing. But small things matter. Sometimes they're the only things that do.